start with just you in general, not just what inspired you to become a filmmaker, but what inspired you to become an animated filmmaker specifically?
That's quite a difficult question to answer because I think, according to family legend, I told my mom that I wanted to get into animation when I was 3 years old, I think. I was drawing from the age of 2. My mom still got the drawings. And they're not bad, actually. I've seen them. They're not too bad. But yeah, it was always something that I wanted to do. I think back then, back in the mists of time, this was pre-internet, pre-DVD, pre-video cassette. But back then, the only way that you could get your fix of animation, really, was to see it either on TV or in the cinema. And Disney would re-release its classics every 7 years, I think. And I think the first Disney movie that I went to see was The Rescuers. And it had this profound effect on me. That and 101 Dalmatians, and I think Pinocchio. Those are the 3 that I remember the most. And there was something about seeing this refined graphic form moving, lifelike movement, the illusion of life, as the Disney guys call it. And from that moment on, as soon as I saw that first Disney movie, I was drawing all the time. And yeah, that was it. I aggressively pursued it from that point on, from the age of 3.
Glad you did, because now we not only have this, but Paranorman, if you haven't seen it, which is also phenomenal.
Oh,
yeah,
thank you.
Well deserved. I am curious with this one, what came first, you putting pen to paper for the script or LAIKA's interest in making its first full-blown comedy?
This was originally, it took 5 years to make the movie, but it predates that by quite a long way. I keep telling people that maybe 15 years ago I started to write this, but I think it might be longer. I think that I have these notebooks. I have like a stack of notebooks that go all the way back to like my teenage years that are full of ideas, and maybe a dozen ideas. I've used 2, so there's still a few to go. But every now and again, I'll delve back into the notebooks and I'll play around with an idea, and then maybe I'll leave it for a year or so, and then I'll go back to it. And this was one of those ideas, and it's mainly because one of my favorite movie of all time, no question, is Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I always felt like there was room to have like a stop-motion Indiana Jones kind of movie. I loved Indiana Jones. I loved Sherlock Holmes as a kid. I was a nut about the Victorian age, and in particular Sherlock Holmes. I found him a very compelling hero because he's incredibly flawed. And so I think the original pitch for this was Indiana Jones meets Sherlock Holmes meets Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. That was the initial thing. And fortunately, Travis went for it as well. But I'd been playing around with this idea for many years.
Well, if that was the pitch, he saw it through for sure. So, starting out at the very beginning with that idea in your notebook, what's the biggest difference between that initial idea and what we just watched tonight?
That's interesting, actually, because the original idea had no Susan, no Link. In fact, it was a completely different adventure. It was Sir Lionel Frost, but it was him chasing unicorns. And in fact, that still survived through to this final one where, when you were in his study, I think there's a book on one of his shelves that's a study of unicorns. So it still survived through to the end. But when I'm coming up with an idea, I'm always kind of playing around with that idea and going off on tangents. And one of the tangents was maybe his second adventure could be trying to find the missing link. And then when I was reading through all my notes, it became very clear very quickly that this guy was the most compelling part of it. And he ended up being, I think, like the beating heart of the story, And as soon as I made the story about him and the yin and yang of Lionel and Susan, that's when it really started to work for me.
So, I mean, you've brought up Susan now a couple of times, and in general, I just love hearing about what inspired someone to name a character a specific name, but here it plays a big part of Susan's journey through the movie. So, why Sir Lionel Frost? And then when Susan gives himself his own name, why that?
So Lionel Frost, I can't even tell you. I think I went through hundreds of different names. I love coming up with names. I know a lot of writers don't enjoy that part because they really struggle with it, but I'm like, I love Dickens. I love how juicy the Dickensian names are. You can tell a Dickens character just by their name before they've even, walked onto the page. And I wanted something of that. I think that's partly why I was playing in a Victorian age. So Sir Lionel Frost, there were various iterations, but I ultimately landed on that because he's a passionate character. There is a lot of he's almost like a giddy schoolboy about his vocation, but he lacks empathy, and that's why the coldness of his character lent itself to Frost. Little on the nose, but that what a sharp nose. And then there was Link, and the Susan thing. To me, this is a story about identity and how your identity is what you choose, and it's not what other people put upon you. So it was important for me to play this scene out where Susan chooses a feminine name, and I was actually frustrated because in the initial trailers they played it off as a joke. Like, isn't it funny? He's got the girl's name, but that wasn't the intention. The intention was always about identity and how it's a unique and independent thing. That's why I chose Susan ultimately, was because it just seemed to work in that moment. Although I think Zach, when we recorded him, he did try Margaret for a while, and that was quite nice. But I went with Susan.
So I have like a million and one behind the scenes questions for you, but just bringing up Zach playing around in the sound booth, given how much work has to go into stop motion animation and all the planning and everything, how much opportunity do your actors have in the booth to kind of play around and feel things through, and then maybe you guys adjust on set while you're shooting this material?
They have every opportunity because they are first. They are way before we do any animation. It's interesting because at that part of the process, when you're directing a movie, there's different hats that you have to wear, and there's different muscles that you have to flex in a sense. And one of them is recording actors, and in a way, it's like the purest form of acting because you're working with these world-class actors, but really all they've got is a script. Nothing else, and it's them in a booth recording their voice. You might have some concept designs, you might have some sketches, a maquette maybe, but really there's nothing. There's nothing for them to play against, and because they're such big names and they're so busy, they often don't record together. So it's them on their own. It's almost like a radio play. So they've got to create this whole world in their head, and that, to me, is the most exciting part, because up until that point, this whole script, this whole story has purely existed in my head. And even in my head, there's a way that the characters say the lines. There's the way that they talk, which is obviously related to me and the way I talk. And what was interesting about Zach was the first recording that I did with him, he had a way of completely deconstructing my lines and putting them back together. He was still doing them, but he was just kind of messing with them and making them his own. Occasionally he would do an ad lib that was brilliant, and I'd try to use that if it wasn't too unusable. But that was the interesting thing for me, was just hearing him make this character his own. Because after that first record, I rewrote all his dialogue for the whole movie. I went home. Even in the booth, I was rewriting it. because suddenly I had a different voice in my head for that character. There was a nuance, there was a rhythm that he brought to it that was entirely his own, and I love that because that's when the character takes its first step into being its own thing. And you know, I think as a director, you don't want to keep hold of everything. You want it to evolve, which is an interesting thing for this movie. But you want the characters to take on a life of their own, and that voice record is the first step of that.
So we've got this wonderful puppet with us right now, and I'm not sure if I'm looking at it properly, but the one thing that I was really interested in is the face kit. And the fact that you guys don't have it on this movie. So is what we're seeing on this face here not the traditional face kit piece that you've had on previous LAIKA films?
In a sense, yes. I mean, I don't know whether any of you are familiar with the way we've done facial animation in the past. We were the first, with Coraline, we were the first studio to use 3D printing to produce different iterations of facial expressions that we would create a kit out of. So we would have a whole facial library where we'd have all these minute iterations of mouths and eyebrows that the animator could piece together to create a line of dialogue. And that's been great for us. We've got amazing results from that. For this movie, I wanted to see where we could push it. And I think we do that on every movie. We're always like, oh, let's take what we did before, but what more can we get from this? And for me, it was nuance and sophistication of performance. So in previous movies, if an animator was animating a line of dialogue, they would have all these selections of pre-existing faces, and they would piece it together in the computer, and then they would get a whole, basically like a tray, an entree tray of selections of faces that they would then plug onto like this. Hang on.
That's
I know.
Creepy.
It's terrifying. And usually these faces come in two parts because the eyebrows are separate from the mouths, which creates that many more iterations. But on this movie, like I say, I wanted more nuance. So every single shot was bespoke. So every single shot was animated by an animator or animators in the computer, in Maya, before it was printed out. So every performance is unique to the shot that it plugs onto. And I think that allows for a sophistication that we've never had before. You know, for me, it was like, the scene on the ship where, the Susan scene, when Lionel is talking to Link. And what I wanted to do, I always think about these movies as live action movies. You know, I don't think about them as cartoons. And I wanted to include lots of reaction shots where you see a close-up of a character reacting to someone else. Not talking, not emoting, just reacting to someone else. And there was one shot in particular where Lionel was listening to Link talk about his background, and his lips were sticking together. His mouth slightly parted, but his lips were sticking together. And it was so real. And then it went through the VFX department, and they cleaned it off because they thought it was a mistake. Oh. So I had to go back and say, no, put that back on. That was real. But it was that level of sophistication that I was looking for. And I've seen this movie, while I was making this movie, I've seen it 500 times. You know, I would watch it regularly. But there was a point where I was watching the finished shots for that scene where they're talking on the ship, where just for a second I forgot that they were puppets. And that's what we're trying to do. You know, I know they're puppets. If anyone knows they're puppets, I do. But just for a second, I believe that these were living, breathing characters, and I think that's ultimately what we want from the audience, is for them to feel compelled.
So compared to Paranorman, would you say that the advancement in terms of getting the facial expressions on your character is one of the greatest tools, or is there anything else that you didn't have in Paranorman that you really needed on this film?
Well, the facial stuff is a big thing. It's interesting because when I saw Kubo, I worked on Kubo originally at the start. And when I saw what they achieved with digital set extensions, I knew that I'd be able to do more. Because I was like, oh, yeah, they've ticked that box. Now I get to play with that. Like for water, for Kubo, they brought on the guy who did Water in Life of Pi to manage the effects team on the water. So I was like, ooh, now I get to do my Storm at Sea sequence. So there's definitely that building upon what we've done before. I think, to be honest, I think the biggest advancement of all was this guy. He's based on a design that I did many, many years ago, a very rough design. I've talked about it a lot, actually, in publicity and stuff, but that sketch I call the hairy avocado sketch, because that's what he is. It was just a very simple shape, and I felt very strongly that the look of this movie should be about dense patterning, but simple geometric shapes. So I wanted this character to basically look like this. But for a puppet, that's very difficult. Because as you can see, he has no shoulders. He has no neck. That becomes incredibly difficult to make as a practical puppet. He's also covered in hair. So they had to engineer this incredibly complex system where individual leaves of hair are riding over the top of each other. It's insane what they achieved, because the thing about silicon is if it creases in the wrong way, you immediately see it as rubber. And I didn't want that. I want you to absolutely believe that this character is covered in hair. Now, it's a stylized world, a very stylized world. So I knew the hair had to be stylized, and we kind of lent into that and used that to engineer a way of moving this character so that it always looked real. So this puppet took a long time to get right in terms of the engineering that's going on underneath this silicon. And it's even different types of silicon. Look how squishy this is. Not so much here. You know, it's different types of silicon, there's all kinds of things going on with the armature underneath. It took, I think, probably a year and a half to get this puppet right. It's probably the most complex puppet that's ever been created. So, you know, just little things like that.
Oh, just little things, no big deal.
At the studio, we've tried to really push what you can achieve with stop motion. And occasionally people will say to me, why not make it CG? Why bother? It's too smooth. It's too sophisticated. And I just don't agree. I think there is something unique. There's something about stop motion. It's real light on real objects. And there is an imperfection to that CG is still chasing. I think you can still, deep down inside you, you can still tell when it's a real object. We're blurring the lines, and we're using a lot of CG, but ultimately we're still trying to, it's the equivalent of practical effects, you know? And I think sometimes, when people say to me, like, you know, I think stop motion should be this medium where you can see the animator's thumbprints, you can see the hair moving or whatever. That's all good. That is an aesthetic choice. And I love that. But I don't think that's a reason. I don't see it as this nostalgic novelty that should be kept in a box, you know? I love Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, but I also think that we should have evolved from that. It's like, I love black and white movies, but that doesn't mean that I don't think there should be color ones. You know, every other medium in film evolves and continues to evolve, and we want this to as well, because we think that that's what will keep it ultimately vital.
Are there any moments in the movie that are VFX that we might not think is done with VFX?
Possibly. There are, I think that what's always been a big challenge has been interaction between CG and puppet characters. And we've always, in the past, we've always kept CG like digital extras in the background because they don't hold up. but I really wanted them to hold up in this. So the bar fight scene, when it came to it, there's like 27 characters in that bar. So to make them as puppets and to ask some poor animator to move them, it just wouldn't be possible. They'd still be there now. So we had to figure out a way to do it. And we did cut those scenes up into different passes. So we had 2 puppets here, and then 6 months later, we'd shoot 2 puppets there. But on some of the wider shots of the fight, we had to have digital extras. So I think that's one of the things I'm proudest of, is that I think there are shots where there are digital characters standing right next to puppets, and they look good. You almost can't tell, or at least you're swept along with it. And the digital extensions as well. I must say, though, that the reason I think for that is that we always start with something practical. So if it's a digital, I think like you saw in the credits, like if you see the Himalayas in the distance, that's clearly a digital mountain range. But we don't just create that in the computer. We have someone in the art department build that as a miniature. I know everything's a miniature, but even more of a miniature. So they'll create this like very crude sculpt out of card or whatever, and they will give that to the VFX department, and they will scan that, and that will be their base for their digital build. So everything has some element of practicality to it. The digital extras, our costume designer, she designs the costumes for the digital extras just the same way that she does for the practical puppets. She sources fabrics. She gets swatches of fabric that they scan, so they get all the fuzz and the imperfection of the stitching. Anything to try and make it feel like it is handmade.
So this question is about where the chicken on the head came from.
Okay, so
it's a great question.
So a big influence on this whole movie was old National Geographic photography. What's his name? Steve McCurry, his portrait photos. But a lot of like 70s and 80s vibrant color National Geographic photography. And I found one photograph of a woman walking down a mountain path with a chicken on her head. And I was like, that's in the movie. I want that. And people kept saying, why? And I was like, it doesn't matter. And then we got a Himalayan cultural expert to talk to us, and she was like, she wouldn't have a chicken on her head. And I'm like, well, how do you know? She's got a chicken on her head. That's her thing. Actually, we did a screening for marketing purposes, and they came back, and I mean, it's too late to do anything by this point, but they came back and said people love the chicken. My response, I think, at the time was, how can they love the chicken? It's a prop. It's not a character. Because they were like, who is your favorite character? And people said the chicken. And I'm like, what? Really? So I put like 6 extra chicken shots in there, just to keep people happy. But yeah, there is no reason. And I think I made sure that there was no reason for the chicken. It's just there.
And still very effective. So the question is, what was the biggest puppet you built for this shoot?
The elephant. So the skeleton, the Odakuro in Kubo, it was, I think, 16 feet tall, I think. And that was like from there up. But I was very heavily rigged. Obviously, the animator couldn't wrestle that thing himself, so everything was rigged. The elephant was probably the biggest puppet that we've ever built that the animator could directly manipulate with his hands. I mean, it was huge. And if you think there's 3 characters riding on the top in the howdah, and they're all this scale. So you've got this guy on the top of an elephant, and suddenly you begin to realize how big that thing was. And it was supported in the side, on the other side that you couldn't see. But I think that was a major achievement. Even though it's only in the movie for a handful of shots, it was a major achievement because we one thing that I said to the guys in the puppet department before we started was, I want the skin to feel like a real elephant. I want it to be loose and wrinkly and move across muscles and bones. So they created this amazing system where the skin rode over the top of this padded armature. I think what they achieved on that will absolutely in some way come into play on future movies, because they were troubleshooting. They were coming up with entirely new ideas for how to make a puppet and how to make its skin. I'm very impressed with that puppet. But that's the biggest one in the movie.
What are the qualities they look for in a storyboard artist at LAIKA?
So my background is storyboarding mainly, and also some character design. And so that's kind of my thing at the studio. I've always been... There is a history in animation of thinking about storyboard artists as gag guys. And I think that's too... I don't think that's enough. I think there are so many talented storyboard artists who become storyboard artists because they are filmmakers. They are aspiring filmmakers, and it's no coincidence that a lot of storyboard artists end up directing. So when I'm looking at storyboards, I don't care about gags. You might not hear this from other studios, but you'll hear it from me. I'm looking for like a knowledge of cutting, of composition. Composition is the main thing. Understanding what the camera is doing. You are essentially, as a storyboard artist, you are director, cinematographer, you are everything. So for me, what I'm looking for is someone who understands film, understands crossing the line, understands screen direction, understands all the fundamental rules of filmmaking. I can't tell you how many storyboard artists I've worked with who have no clue about any of that stuff. They think storyboarding is just about doing funny stuff. For me, it's not. It's more than that. Because the more tied down your storyboard is, the more sure you are of the end result. That's how I started. And that's why stop motion was such a revelation to me, because when I started storyboarding for stop motion, I started to think a lot more about the camera and where it was and where it could be and where it should be. And yeah, I think that's what I look for, is a thorough understanding of filmic rules.
What was it like working with Carter Burwell?
I am such a fan of Carter. And I think the interesting thing was that this isn't his kind of movie. And that's why I wanted to work with him. I am a huge fan of the Coen brothers and everything that he's done for them. I just love his music. So initially, when they say, who do you want to work with, I said Carter Burwell. And so we reached out to him, and I think he took it as a challenge. Like, he was like, all right, I've not done an action sequence like that, but I'll give it a go. And I think he found it difficult. I don't think it was easy for him. But that was the point, was when he said to me, like, why do you want me to do this? It's because I want your version of this, because it won't sound like anyone else's version of this. I'm really happy with what we ended up with. Yeah, absolute joy to work with. And I got to, go and record with him in Abbey Road. I know.
So how much of the lighting is done on set or in post?
All of it is done on set, or at least an attempt is done on set. I think where the challenge comes is when you start compositing this stuff. So, for example, I was talking about the bar scene. We were shooting that over a year and a half, and we were shooting not just different shots over that time period, but different elements of the same shot over that period. Because let's say you're shooting a shot that's got 6 characters in it, but only 2 puppets are available. So we'll shoot them on green screen. 6 months later, we come back to shoot another 2 characters on green screen. Now, you're trying to match lighting 6 months later. So no matter how good you are, when you start to piece that together, that's where the problems start to arise. That's where you spend a lot of time. I spent a lot of time before going to the color grade, Technicolor. I spent a lot of time with our VFX supervisor just and our cinematographer and our production designer just going through the whole movie, shot by shot, like, where should we be? Where should we be? We had a color script, and we had a really, really good color script. I think it's the best color script that we've had at the studio ever. It was pretty, locked down. But even so, just the nature of shooting over such a long time, over 2 years, that's where you start to come into problems, especially in the bar scene where you've got multiple light sources, and when you start to see it pieced together, and it's like, this isn't the same at all. So there was a lot of riding that. And then, of course, you take advantage of the grade to try and accentuate mood and tone. But we're working from a color script from day one, which is pretty locked.
Before we let you go, I have to ask, because I'm a fan of this movie, I'm a fan of Paranorman, I'm a fan of all LAIKA movies, and there's nothing I want to see more than to see LAIKA movies get out to a wider audience. And I am curious what kind of conversations are going on over there to make sure that happens, because Academy Awards are wonderful, and I'm so happy for you, but you also deserve to be seen by the widest possible audience as well. So what are you guys doing, and what can folks in this room do to help you out?
God,
I've talked about this nonstop.
Just don't hold back. No, it is a good question. It's a question that I've pondered myself. It's a difficult thing. The box office measure of a movie is flawed. I think we all know that. The landscape, until streaming came along, was becoming unworkable for independent movies, in a sense. For example, the release date of Missing Link was sandwiched between Shazam and Dumbo on one side and Avengers Endgame on the other. So we had no hope. Within a week, all our screens had gone. You can't win in that situation. I think I've spoken to many people along the way who feel like the way to make that work is to beat those people at their own game. But you can't. We're talking about Disney. They own the frickin' world. So, and we're not making those kinds of movies, and I don't want to. I love those movies. I'm an animation fan. I love everything that's out there. I love Disney. I love Pixar. I love DreamWorks. I love all those things. But I don't want to copy them. I don't want to ape them in order to make money. I want to continue to make movies that have their own voice. That's the trick, is finding how do you fit in? How do you make that work in this landscape? I don't believe you can make it work in the box office, which is entirely governed by how many bums you get on seats in the opening weekend. We can't win in that system. So I think what needs to happen is a conversation about what's next. Interestingly enough, the landscape is changing. Streaming is making things very different. You look at the Oscar nominations this year, it is probably the most diverse lineup of nominees that we've ever had. And that's because of Netflix. I think it would be wrong to think of Netflix as an independent studio, because they're not. But what they've allowed is for diversity of content. And I think that ultimately is where you get a bit more creative freedom. If you look at Klaus, if you look at I Lost My Body, those movies would not be made to be released theatrically. They just wouldn't survive. So I think it's wonderful that streaming is allowing for more diversity of content. Where we fit in, I'm not sure yet. But I'm, as disappointing as the box office for this movie was, critically, it's very exciting. The award season, more exciting. The more people, it's given us a chance to get it out there to more people. And that's the thing. When people see it, they love it. So, yeah, I agree. It's a difficult situation. And over the past 10 years, the makeup of, film releases has changed quite a lot. We've just got to figure it out.
Well, until you figure it out, guys, Coraline, Paranorman, The Box Trolls, Kubo and the Two Strings, and Academy Award nominee Missing Link. I hope you enjoyed it tonight. Spread the word for all of those movies. Chris, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, everyone.
Big thanks to Arclight for having us tonight. Have a good evening, everyone.